In the 21st century, moreover, healthy relationships are indispensable to ensuring national security. Objectives such as halting the proliferation of WMDs and preserving access to oil cannot be attained by military might alone. International institutions like the World Trade Organization rely on cooperation rather than brute force. Additionally, our unrivaled military is helpless against threats such as the penetration of the U.S. information infrastructure. Only the maintenance of strong alliances can alleviate these modern problems. Contention 2. Submitting to the court will further the prosecution of terrorist networks. Roberta Arnold, author of the International Criminal Court as a new instrument for repressing terrorism, argues that since terrorism is often a brutal, large-scale violation of rights, it ought to be considered a crime against humanity. In fact, ICC prosecutor Louis Ocampo has publicly stated that he would be willing to prosecute al-Qaeda for crimes against humanity. In the 21st century, terrorism should be the most important crime against humanity on our national agenda. Globalization has caused the proliferation of shadowy transnational terrorist groups that are difficult to target by military campaigns alone. An international court will facilitate the prosecution of terrorists for 2 reasons. First, an international court will promote evidence sharing. Both the perpetrators and victims of terrorism often transcend national borders. Thus, it is difficult to collect sufficient evidence for conviction from one country alone. If, hypothetically, Osama bin Laden were captured, he would have claims against Kenya, Tanzania, the UK, Spain, Afghanistan, Iraq, and the US, all of whose jurisdictions would be in direct competition. An international court will unite victimized countries like these and result in a more effective trial. Second, submitting will increase the likelihood that other countries will hand over suspects. John Seguin writes in the Boston University Law Review, the court would provide a neutral international forum in which to prosecute terrorists, which may increase the likelihood that countries holding suspected terrorists would turn them over to be tried. Nor are these arguments merely theoretical. The international community has already seen the consequences of disunity in the prosecution of terrorists. For example, when Germany attempted to try Munir al-Mutazadek, a member of al-Qaeda, the U.S. refused to turn over 2 other members to testify. Similarly, Spain has in custody 24 individuals suspected of planning the 9/11 attacks, but has refused to turn them over to the U.S. In essence, the largest terrorist case in history is spread between 3 nations, all interfering with the other's ability to prosecute. To oppose such a valuable multilateral tool as an international court exactly when the U.S. needs to construct a coalition against worldwide terrorism is simply foolish. In sum, formulating a cooperative foreign policy is essential to maintaining alliances and thwarting terrorism in the 21st century. Submitting to the jurisdiction of an international court would considerably advance our ability to make such a policy. I now stand open for cross-examination.
I would like to use some prep time.
And alongside John Mercer, who's the debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School. John, what did the candidates or the debaters have to do to get to this point?
Both debaters were competing all season long in the north coast of the National Forensic League, which includes most of Greater Cleveland. And we had our national district finals not long ago, and they were the top 2 finishers at that tournament.
Right now, we're basically waiting as they begin the process of getting their thoughts together. What are they doing right now?
Both debaters will have exactly the same structure or opportunities. Both debaters will be given a chance to give their side of the story, their constructive speech. Both debaters will be given an opportunity to cross-X, which is going to begin right about now as I see the debaters are heading to the podium. So let's go back to the debate.
So your value is governmental obligations?
Yes.
Can you define the word ought?
Ought designates obligation. If I ought to do something, I have an obligation to do it.
So let's say a hitman agrees that he's going to kill somebody. He has an obligation to kill that person by his contract.
No, because that obligation conflicts with his prior obligation to obey the law and to protect the right to life. Okay. So when he made that contract, he was acting in an immoral manner.
Yeah, so do you think that obligation has to do with what our moral standings are?
Well, moral obligation isn't the only type of obligation. There's also legal obligations.
Yes, but why should we be debating about legal obligations over moral obligations?
We're debating obligations in general. I don't specify what type we're debating.
Okay. Let's look towards national security as your value criterion.
Yes.
Do we have to consider the rights of other people throughout the world, like whenever we're making some, whenever we're trying to make distinctions about our obligations?
Yes, in the sense that doing so promotes our national security, because if we violate the rights of non-Americans in an extreme way, we're going to suffer backlash and exclusion by the international community, which will end up harming our national security.
Okay. Now let's move towards the first contention. You say that unilateralism is a bad thing, essentially, right?
Not always. I'm saying that in this case, when the vote has been 120-7, and only one other democracy, that's Israel, has refused to join the court, then in this case, unilateralism makes us look arrogant.
So why does the negative world have to promote unilateralism by not submitting to an international court?
That's the definition of unilateralism, acting
Why?
alone.
Why
Unilateralism
alone?
That's the definition of unilateralism.
So it's either we submit to an international court or we act alone
Yes.
and use our own force.
Yes.
Okay. Now let's go to the second contention about terrorist networks. Should we be trying to focus on prosecuting terrorists or stopping more terrorist events from happening in the first place?
Both. And I would say that those two goals completely complement each other, because if we prosecute terrorists, that's a way to deter future atrocities.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How does prosecuting terrorists deter those atrocities?
By creating fear, because terrorists in the future will be scared of being prosecuted, thus they'll be less likely to commit acts of terrorism.
Did the United States invasion into Afghanistan and Iraq create fear for these terrorists?
I don't know. That's the effectiveness of those invasions.
So
is
killing
completely
hundreds of thousands
outside.
of people did not produce fear for terrorists.
Well, first of all, that's an act of unilateralism. That goes against the negative completely. Second of all, I don't have to defend the effectiveness of either the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq.
Yes, but
that's completely irrelevant.
We're talking
to the
about
resolution.
you're saying that they will be deterred because they're fearful. This produced some fear. Why are they not being deterred right now?
If we can successfully prosecute terrorists, then ultimately that will end up providing a deterrent effect.
Okay. Thank you.
We've been watching Omar questioning Vinay, and I'm joined now by the debate coach at Olmsted Falls High School, John Mercer. What's the strategy they use? What's the goal that the person who's asking the questions is trying to get at?
Well, there's a multitude of different strategies that they might choose from, probably as many as there are debaters. But basically, when you're cross-axing your opponent, you're trying to find either a hole in their argument, or you're trying to get them to say something that you can use against them later on in the debate. Now, I'm not going to comment on this particular cross-ax since the debaters might be able to hear us.
Sure, but that's the general strategy.
The general strategy is to make sure, or is to try to find a hole, because the next step in this process is going to be the rebuttal. We haven't had both constructive speeches. We'll have the second constructive speech, we'll have the second cross-ex, and then both debaters will have a chance to rebut. So they'll use the information that they've gotten from their opponent during their construction and their cross-examination to rebut their case.
How much preparation does it take for them to prepare for a single debate like this?
Hours. The debate topics remain debate topics nationally for a 2-month period of time. And in addition to summer camps that are devoted to studying the process and the topics, each debate team will meet hours after school each day. Debaters will get together on their own, and the result is very prepared debaters as we're seeing today.
We're watching what's known as a Lincoln-Douglas debate. Briefly, what is that?
Well, Lincoln-Douglas debate is one-on-one debate. It's named after the famed Lincoln-Douglas debates in Illinois in 1858, where Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas went after it in several different cities, one-on-one. In the National Forensic League and the Ohio High School Speech League, there are other styles of debate. There are team debates, some focused on policy, some focused on current events. So a student would have a wide variety of choices in terms of what kind of debating she or he would like to do.
John Mercer, what are the judges focusing on as they listen to this debate?
Well, the judges are going to look at a multitude of different things, including clash, presentation, and clarity. I see that we're about ready to hear our negative constructive speech, so let's return to the debaters.